James had been a taxi driver in New York City for years. He barely made ends meet, working long hours just to keep up with rent. But despite his struggles, he had a rule. If someone truly needed a ride, he'd never turn them away, even if they couldn't pay. That's how he met Mr. Langston. An elderly blind man, dressed in simple clothes, who always asked for a ride to the park. James never charged him. "What's a few dollars when someone needs help?" he'd say with a shrug. What James didn't know was that Mr. Langston wasn't just any old man. He was the sole heir to a massive fortune. And soon James' kindness would come back to him in a way he never expected.
Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Here at Stephen True Life Tales, we share real-life stories that touch the heart, inspire the soul, and make you think about the little moments that truly matter. We're on an exciting journey to reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and we'd be thrilled to have you join us on this adventure. So, if you enjoy stories about life, love, betrayal, redemption, and everything in between, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications. Now, let's get started with today's story.
James had always been a man of routine. Every morning, he slipped into his worn-out jacket, grabbed a quick cup of coffee, and headed out to the crowded streets of New York City. His taxi, an aging yellow cab, was his constant companion. The city never stopped moving, and neither did he. But the hours on the road were long, and the tips weren't always enough to make ends meet. Life as a taxi driver wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and James had grown to appreciate its simplicity. It was during one of those early mornings, when the sun was just starting to rise, that he first met Mr. Langston. James had just dropped off a couple at the airport when he noticed an elderly man standing on the sidewalk. The man was holding a white cane, and his movements were slow but deliberate. He wore a long, faded coat, the kind of coat that spoke of years of use, not luxury. The man raised his cane and waved it in the air, and James instinctively pulled over to the curb. "Need a ride, sir?" James asked, rolling down the window. The old man nodded, his voice soft and steady. "Yes, please. I need to go to the park." James opened the door for him, noting the man's blind eyes as he climbed into the back seat. He had seen many elderly passengers over the years, but something about this man intrigued him. As James started the engine and pulled into traffic, he glanced in the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" "Central Park," came the simple response. "Got it." James shifted into drive and began weaving through the morning rush hour. The streets were already busy, but James had a knack for navigating the traffic. "Not much of a talker, huh?" James said, trying to fill the silence. "You from around here?" The old man chuckled softly. "Born and raised young man. But I've been gone for many years." James looked at him curiously. "What brings you back, if you don't mind me asking?" There was a long pause. For a moment, James thought the man hadn't heard him, but then the old man spoke. "I've come to find something I lost a long time ago." The mystery in his voice made James raise an eyebrow, but before he could ask more, the old man continued. "I don't have much time left, you know," Mr. Langston said quietly, almost as if to himself. "I'm just trying to make peace with my past." James didn't know what to say. He had picked up all sorts of passengers over the years, tourists, businessmen, families, but this was different. There was an air of sadness about the old man, as if he was carrying a heavy burden. "Well, you know," James said after a moment, "we all have our burdens. But sometimes talking helps lighten the load." Mr. Langston smiled faintly. "Maybe so." As they reached the edge of Central Park, the old man's hand reached out and tapped the side of the door. "This is where I'll get off." James pulled over and opened the door. He helped Mr. Langston out, and as the man stepped onto the sidewalk, he turned back to James. "Thank you for the ride," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "You didn't have to do this, you know. Most people would have charged me." James shrugged, a humble smile on his face. "It's nothing really. It's just a ride." But as Mr. Langston began to walk away, he stopped, paused, and turned back. "Tell you what," the old man said, his expression thoughtful. "I'll make sure I remember your kindness. I have a feeling we'll meet again, James." James watched him walk into the park, the soft tap of his cane fading into the background noise of the city. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something big. But at the time he shrugged it off. After all, it was just another ride. Or so he thought. Over the next few weeks, James found himself picking up the same elderly man at least 3 or 4 times. Mr. Langston had grown to be a regular passenger, but there was still something about him that James couldn't quite put his finger on. The old man never asked for much, just rides to the park, the library, or to various quiet spots around the city. Despite his wealth of life experience, he never spoke much about his past, and James respected his silence. But it was during one of those rides, just a few days after their first encounter, when things began to take an unexpected turn. "Morning, James," Mr. Langston greeted him with a soft smile as he climbed into the back of the taxi. His usual cane was clutched in his hand, but his movements seemed slower today, as though the weight of the world was bearing down on him. James greeted him back and glanced at the rearview mirror. "How's it going today, sir?" Mr. Langston leaned back in his seat, his fingers gently gripping the edge of the seat. Same as always, I suppose. A bit tired, though." James noticed a certain heaviness in his tone. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. There was something deeper, something unspoken. "You sure you're all right, Mr. Langston?" James asked, his concern growing. The old man hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I'm afraid not, my friend. I've been living with this burden for far too long." James didn't push him further, but he felt a pang of sympathy. The city was hard on everyone, but it seemed like Mr. Langston was carrying a weight far heavier than most. As they cruised along the busy streets, James couldn't help but glance at him every now and then. The old man's wrinkles deepened with age, but his eyes, though clouded by blindness, still held a sharpness that James had never seen in someone so old. There was a quiet dignity to him, a sense of history and untold stories. When they reached the park, Mr. Langston asked him to pull over near a small bench under a tree. "I'll be here for a while today," Mr. Langston said. "You can take a break if you like, James." "I'll be fine." James nodded, his curiosity piqued. "I'll grab a coffee from the cart then. Let me know if you need anything." Mr. Langston smiled faintly. "Thank you, my friend." James grabbed his coffee and wandered around the park for a while, his mind racing. He had always been intrigued by the older man, but today there was something different, something pulling him toward a revelation. When he returned after about 20 minutes, he was taken aback. Mr. Langston was sitting on the bench, a letter in his hands. It looked old, tattered at the edges, and James couldn't help but wonder what it contained. "Everything all right, sir?" James asked, trying not to sound too nosy. Mr. Langston nodded, folding the letter carefully. "Just a letter from an old friend," he said cryptically. "But I suppose it's time to tell you a little more about myself, James?" James stood still, his curiosity sparking even more. "I'm listening." Mr. Langston took a deep breath and began speaking in a low voice. "I was once a very different man, you know. I had everything: wealth, power, a family who loved me." He paused for a moment as if the memories were painful to relive. "But I lost it all. Lost it to my own mistakes, to pride, and to stubbornness. I turned my back on a legacy I was meant to inherit." James listened intently. He had never heard the old man speak like this before, and it tugged at something deep inside him. "I walked away from it all," Mr. Langston continued, "thinking it would give me peace. But peace never came. The years passed, and I realized too late that I had given up not just my fortune, but the chance to make things right." James wasn't sure how to respond. The words the old man was speaking were so full of regret, yet there was something noble in his willingness to share this with a near stranger. "You know," James said quietly, "a lot of people have regrets. The important thing is you're still here. You can still do something about it." Mr. Langston smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Maybe. But time, James, time waits for no one." Just then the old man's hand brushed his jacket pocket, and he pulled out a business card. He handed it to James with a steady hand. "Take this," he said. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you. But not here. Come by my estate tomorrow. I want to talk to you in person." James stared at the card, confused. The name on the card was simple: Langston Enterprises. It looked like something that would be printed on the letterhead of a corporate office, not something an old man would casually hand out. "Your estate?" James asked, still processing. Mr. Langston nodded. "Yes. I want you to meet my daughter." The next day, James found himself staring at the business card Mr. Langston had given him, a mix of curiosity and uncertainty swirling inside him. Langston Enterprises. It didn't seem to match the image of the humble, blind old man he had been driving around for weeks. He had been expecting something far more modest. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Langston than met the eye. A man who had walked away from immense wealth, who had a daughter he wanted James to meet. The invitation felt strange, almost surreal. But the more James thought about it, the more he realized there was only one way to find out what was going on. He checked the address on the business card. It was a large estate on the outskirts of the city, one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in New York. the kind of place people only dreamt of living in. When he arrived at the estate, he was taken aback. The gates alone looked like they belonged in a royal palace, with tall stone walls and a sleek, modern design. It was far grander than anything James had ever seen before. As he pulled up to the front entrance, a well-dressed butler opened the door and greeted him with a polite smile. "Welcome to Langston Manor. Mr. Langston is expecting you." James hesitated, unsure if he belonged in such an extravagant place. The butler ushered him inside, and as soon as he crossed the threshold, James was struck by the opulence of the place. The high ceilings, the grand chandelier that hung from the center of the room, and the tastefully decorated walls all screamed wealth in a way James had only seen in magazines. The butler led him through the halls to a large sitting room, where Mr. Langston was seated in a plush armchair by the window. He looked much the same as he did when James saw him in the taxi. Frail, older, but there was something different about the way he held himself. There was an air of authority about him now, as if the years of hard living had been replaced by a quiet confidence. "James," Mr. Langston said, rising slowly from the chair. "I'm glad you came." "Of course, sir," James replied, unsure what to expect. Mr. Langston motioned for him to sit, and the butler brought over tea. They exchanged pleasantries for a few moments before the old man's tone shifted. "I know this must be a bit overwhelming," Mr. Langston began, "but I wanted to explain a few things." James nodded, his curiosity growing. "Please, sir. I don't know what to expect." Mr. Langston chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "I suppose you're wondering why I invited you here. You're probably thinking that I'm just some lonely old man who needs company." He paused, his expression turning serious. "But I assure you, James, there's more to this than meets the eye." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "Years ago, I made a mistake," Mr. Langston said, his voice tinged with regret. "I walked away from everything, my family, my fortune, my legacy. I thought I was doing the right thing, but in reality, I was only running from my own fears." He sighed heavily. "I've spent all these years in regret trying to find peace. But I've come to realize something. Peace isn't something you find by running away. It's something you build." James was silent, absorbing his words. Mr. Langston continued, "I have a daughter, Emily. She's everything to me, James. But she's also everything to this family's legacy. You see, Emily's mother and I made a pact long ago. I would leave the fortune to her and she would carry on the family name. But I've never been able to fully involve myself in that world again. I was afraid that my past mistakes would poison her future." James furrowed his brow. "But what does that have to do with me?" "Everything," Mr. Langston said with a piercing look. "I've been watching you for a while, James. You're not like the others in this world. You don't want anything from me. You don't care about my money. And that's why I believe you're the right person for my daughter." James blinked, stunned. "Wait, you want me to marry your daughter?" Mr. Langston's eyes softened. "Not just marry her, James. I want you to take over the business. The legacy. You've shown me that you're a man of character, someone who values kindness over wealth. Emily needs someone who can keep that same spirit alive, even when faced with power and influence." James' heart raced as the weight of the situation hit him. He had never once considered something like this. He was just a taxi driver, a man who barely made enough to survive. And yet, here he was being asked to marry the daughter of a billionaire, to take over a multi-million-dollar legacy. "I know this sounds impossible," Mr. Langston said, almost as if he could read James' mind. "But you have to understand, James, time is running out for me. I can't do this anymore. I need someone who can step into my place. Someone who isn't corrupted by greed." James was speechless. He didn't know what to think, what to say. He had spent his entire life fighting to make ends meet, and now he was being offered a chance to change everything. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts, and a woman entered the room. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with bright green eyes and an air of elegance about her. It was clear she was used to the luxuries that surrounded her, but there was a warmth in her smile that caught James off guard. "James, this is Emily," Mr. Langston said, gesturing toward her. "My daughter." James stood up slowly, and Emily extended her hand with a soft smile. "It's nice to finally meet you." As their hands touched, James couldn't help but feel the gravity of the situation. This was it, the turning point in his life. The question was, what would he do with it? As the days passed, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a dream. One moment he was struggling to make ends meet as a taxi driver, and the next he found himself in a mansion, being introduced to the daughter of a wealthy family, and offered a future beyond anything he had ever imagined. Emily seemed kind, thoughtful, and everything Mr. Langston had promised, but James wasn't sure how to navigate the whirlwind he had found himself in. The mansion felt foreign to him, the luxury overwhelming. Yet there was a quiet reassurance in Mr. Langston's words that kept drawing him in. "You should talk to Emily," Mr. Langston had told him just the day before. "You need to understand her, James. You two might just be the missing piece to one another's lives." James had agreed, though he couldn't help but feel like a fish out of water. His mind was clouded with questions. Could he really take over a business empire? Could he marry a woman from a world so different from his own? Could he live up to the legacy that Mr. Langston had spent years building? That evening, Mr. Langston invited James and Emily to dinner at the estate. The dining room was vast, with a long table laid out with silver cutlery and delicate crystal glasses. There was something intimidating about the space, yet Emily's easy smile and warmth made James feel at ease. "Do you mind if I ask you something personal?" Emily asked after a few minutes of casual conversation. James raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Emily smiled. "I've been wondering something. Why do you do this? Why drive a taxi every day when it seems like you could be doing so much more?" James chuckled softly, his nerves easing just a little. "I suppose it's just what I know. I never had the chance to do much else. Things are tough and I take whatever work I can get. It's honest work at least." She nodded, her gaze softening. "I understand. My father always told me that hard work is what matters most, but I think he forgets what it's like to struggle. He's always been wrapped up in the world of money and business." James found himself growing more comfortable with Emily. Her thoughts were different from the privileged world she came from, and he could relate to that. She wasn't just some rich girl out of touch with the reality of life. She understood the importance of hard work, even if she had never truly experienced the struggle herself. As dinner came to an end, Mr. Langston spoke up. "I know this might be overwhelming for you, James," he began, his tone more serious than before. "But I'm asking you to consider what I've offered. Emily and this company, this legacy. It needs someone who can help carry it forward." James looked at Emily, who met his gaze with a steady, almost searching look. "I believe in what my father is saying, James," she said softly. "But it's not just about business. It's about trust. If you were to become a part of this family, I want you to do it because you believe in what we stand for." James paused, taking in the weight of her words. The room seemed quieter now, the air thick with unspoken expectations. But something in his gut told him he needed to make a choice. I don't know if I can," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I've spent my whole life just getting by. All of this is so far out of my world." Mr. Langston smiled, his eyes kind but filled with resolve. "James, I understand that. But think of what you could do with all this. You've shown me that you have a good heart. That's what matters more than anything in this world." James looked at Emily again. She was watching him intently, as if waiting for his decision. Her father's words had weight, but so did the quiet confidence in Emily's eyes. "What do you think, Emily?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "I think you should follow your heart, James. Whatever you choose, we'll respect it. But if you decide to join us, you won't just be marrying into a family. You'll be joining a future." James looked from Emily to Mr. Langston, and for the first time in his life, he felt the pressure of a choice that could change everything. The opportunity was enormous, but so was the risk. Was he really ready to take that leap? Suddenly, it all made sense. He wasn't just being asked to take over a business. He was being invited into a new world, one where he could finally escape the struggle he had known all his life and build something real, something lasting. "I need some time to think," James said, standing up from the table. "This is a lot to process." Mr. Langston nodded, his eyes understanding. "Take all the time you need, James. But know this, if you decide to take this path, it won't just change your life. It will change ours too." Days turned into weeks, and James' mind was a whirlwind of doubt and confusion. He spent hours walking through the city trying to clear his head, but every street he passed, every familiar corner, reminded him of his life before the Langstons. The life he knew. What if he turned down the offer? What would happen to him then? Would he remain a taxi driver forever, scraping by? Or would he risk everything for a chance at a life he'd never imagined? A life that could be his, if he accepted Mr. Langston's proposal? He had never dreamed of wealth, of power, of living in luxury. But he also knew that he couldn't keep struggling forever. There was a constant ache in his chest, a longing for something more. For the first time he felt like he had an actual choice. The idea of stepping into a world so far removed from his own was terrifying. The people, the expectations, the responsibility, It was overwhelming. But then there was Emily. Her warmth, her understanding, the way she made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could be more than just the guy driving a cab. That night he made his decision. He stood in front of the full-length mirror in his tiny apartment, staring at his reflection. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, trying to calm his racing heart. He had always been the kind of man who took things one step at a time, but this was different. This decision wasn't just about him. It was about Emily. It was about the future they could build together. James called the Langstons and asked to meet with them. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that if he was going to make this leap, he needed to do it now. When he arrived at the mansion, he was ushered into the same grand sitting room where everything had started. Mr. Langston was sitting in his usual chair, his expression expectant, but there was a softness to it now. Emily stood by the window, her gaze lost in the view of the estate's gardens. "James," Mr. Langston said, standing as he entered, "I'm glad you came." Emily turned to face him, her eyes scanning him with quiet hope. "Have you made your decision?" James took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I have." There was a brief silence before he continued. "I've thought about it a lot. I've thought about what I want, and what I can offer. And I've realized that I don't want to live in the shadows anymore. I don't want to just survive. I want to build something. I want to be a part of something bigger than myself." He looked at Emily, his voice steady. "And I think that something could be with you." A small smile touched Emily's lips, and James could see the relief in her eyes. "You mean it?" she asked softly. "I do," James replied. "I know it won't be easy. There are things I don't understand, things I have to learn. But I'm willing to try. I want to be a part of this. And I want to build a future with you." Mr. Langston's face softened as he stepped forward, placing a hand on James' shoulder. "I'm proud of you, James. This isn't just about wealth. It's about character, about integrity, about understanding the value of people over money. That's why I believe you're the right person for Emily and for this legacy." James turned to Emily, his eyes locking with hers. "So what do you say? Will you let me try?" Emily smiled brightly, her eyes sparkling. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "Yes, I will." It was a moment that felt surreal, as if time itself had paused just for them. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he realized that he wasn't just stepping into a new life. He was stepping into a partnership. A future. Mr. Langston smiled knowingly, his eyes filled with pride and relief. "I believe this is the beginning of something great. Welcome to the family, James." And just like that, James' life had changed forever. He wasn't just a taxi driver anymore. He wasn't just the man who helped an old man in need. He was now part of something much bigger, a legacy, a business, a family. And with Emily by his side, he felt like he could face anything. The following weeks were a blur of change for James. The world he had once known, the world of yellow taxis, crowded streets, and endless hours behind the wheel, seemed like a distant memory. Now he was surrounded by the comforts of a mansion, a powerful business empire, and the constant hum of luxury that came with the Langston name. But it wasn't just the material changes that overwhelmed him. It was the responsibility. Mr. Langston had handed him more than just a job. He had handed him the keys to a future, one that was filled with expectations and high stakes. James had always been a man of simple means, but now he was expected to think big, to understand markets, investments, and the intricacies of running a billion-dollar business. Emily was there by his side, guiding him through the early days. She wasn't just a partner in name, she became his mentor, patiently teaching him the ropes. Together, they spent hours in the company's boardroom, poring over financial reports and strategic plans, with Emily explaining concepts that had once seemed like a foreign language to James. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. The deeper James delved into the world of high society and business, the more he realized how far removed he was from the people he had once known. He didn't quite fit in at the upscale events, the gala dinners, and the networking parties. At times, he felt like an imposter, surrounded by millionaires and CEOs who had spent their lives in the lap of luxury. One evening, after a particularly exhausting gala, James found himself alone on the balcony of the mansion, looking out over the sprawling grounds. Emily had stayed behind to chat with some of the guests, and James needed a moment to himself. He ran his hand through his hair, staring at the distant horizon. "What am I doing here?" he muttered to himself. "How did I get so far from where I came from?" Just then, Emily appeared beside him, her soft footsteps barely audible on the stone floor. She leaned against the railing, her gaze following his. "You're doing fine, James," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself." James turned to her, his expression conflicted. I feel like I'm not cut out for this. It's all so overwhelming. I'm not like these people. Emily smiled gently, a warmth in her eyes that made him feel understood. You're not like them, and that's okay. You have something they don't: authenticity. You've been through things they can't even imagine. Don't let this world change who you are. Just stay true to yourself and you'll find your place here. James looked at her, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. I'm glad you're here with me, Emily. She reached over and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. I'm here because I believe in you, James. I'm here because I want this too. This is our journey. Together. And in that moment, James realized something crucial. This wasn't just about the wealth, the business, or the mansion. It was about the partnership he had with Emily. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. As time went on, James grew more comfortable in his new role. He began to learn the intricacies of the Langston business, applying his own sense of integrity and fairness to decision-making. He started to build relationships with the employees and clients, slowly earning their respect, not just as the new guy but as someone with a genuine desire to make a difference. One day, Mr. Langston called him into his office for a meeting. James had grown used to these meetings where they would discuss business strategies, but today felt different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. James, Mr. Langston began, I've been watching you closely and I have to say I'm impressed. You've adapted quicker than I expected. You've shown me that you're capable of more than I even thought. James smiled nervously, unsure where this conversation was heading. Thank you, sir. I'm still learning, but I'm doing my best. Mr. Langston leaned forward, his tone more serious. You've earned my trust, James. And I believe you're ready for the next step. James blinked, confused. The next step? Mr. Langston nodded. I want you to take over more of the operations. You've proven yourself capable, and I'm ready to pass on more responsibility to you. I'm not getting any younger, James. I need to know the business will be in good hands when I retire. James' heart raced. This was the moment he had feared, and yet he couldn't help but feel a rush of pride. He had gone from being a taxi driver to running a billion-dollar empire. But was he truly ready? I'm honored, James said slowly. But I'm also a little scared. Mr. Langston smiled knowingly. Good. Fear keeps you grounded. But remember, you have the heart, the wisdom, and the courage to make it happen. You've already proven that. James felt the weight of the responsibility, but he also felt something else. A sense of excitement, a spark of possibility. This was his time. And so, James embraced his new role. He worked alongside Emily, learning and growing each day. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, James felt like he had a purpose. He wasn't just a man taking up space in a luxury mansion. He was a man with a future, a family, and a legacy to build. Together, James and Emily would create something lasting, something real. And as the sun set over the mansion, James knew that his journey was only just beginning. As months passed, James continued to prove himself, not just to Mr. Langston, but to the entire Langston Corporation. The once uncertain taxi driver was now the CEO in the making, integrating his values of honesty, fairness, and hard work into every business decision. His ability to empathize with people, the very trait that had made him so successful as a driver, made him a beloved leader in the company. Emily stood by his side through it all. Their relationship blossomed into a deep and unshakable partnership, both in business and in life. Emily's strength complemented his determination, and together, they began to reshape the future of the Langston Empire, one rooted in integrity and compassion rather than the cold pursuit of wealth. James often thought back to those first days, how uncertain he had been, how far he had come. Every now and then he'd walk out to the balcony of their mansion and look at the city below, just as he had on that first night. But this time he didn't feel lost. He didn't feel like an imposter. He felt like he belonged. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of gold and purple, Mr. Langston called James into his office. The older man was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, papers neatly stacked, but his face wore a look of calm reflection. James, I think it's time, Mr. Langston said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You've earned it. I'm ready to step back and officially hand the reins over to you. James felt a wave of emotion hit him, pride, gratitude, and even fear. But mostly he felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had worked hard to earn this moment, but he couldn't deny the weight it carried. You've done more than just manage my business, Mr. Langston continued, looking directly at him. You've built something more valuable, a legacy. And I know it will continue to grow with you at the helm. James swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I'm ready for this, but I'm ready to try. I'll honor everything you've built and make sure it continues to flourish. Mr. Langston smiled, a rare moment of vulnerability in his eyes. That's all I can ask for. And I believe in you, James. As James left Mr. Langston's office, he sought out Emily, who was waiting for him in their shared study. She stood by the window, the same soft smile lighting up her face as she caught sight of him. Well? She asked, her voice filled with anticipation. James took a deep breath and smiled. It's official. It's ours now. The future, it's ours. Emily rushed over, wrapping her arms around him in a warm embrace. I knew you could do it, James. Together we'll make this our own. This legacy our legacy. And just like that, James realized that this wasn't just about running a business or stepping into a new life. It was about creating something that would last. A legacy built on love, trust, and the values that had brought him this far. In the years that followed, James and Emily transformed the Langston Corporation into a model of compassion, innovation, and success. They used their influence to help communities, support charitable causes, and mentor young entrepreneurs who shared their vision. Their love grew stronger with each passing day, their partnership an example of what could be achieved when two people believed in each other and in the greater good. Together, they not only became the leaders of a billion-dollar company, they became a beacon of hope for others. As James stood in front of the grand estate one evening, looking out at the sprawling city below, he no longer saw a man who had come from humble beginnings, struggling to make ends meet. He saw a man who had built something real, something that would outlast him. And he knew that no matter where his journey had begun, it had led him exactly where he was meant to be. With Emily, his partner in every sense of the word, building a future that would inspire generations to come.
Thank you for watching Stephen True Life Tales. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We're on a mission to share meaningful stories and hit our first 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to us. Before you go, check out the other videos popping up on your screen right now. Each one is packed with heartfelt moments and unforgettable lessons. We'll see you in the next story.